Hello! For this tasting, I wanted to take a look at a wine from a producer I've reviewed fairly recently. So this is Castano from the region in Spain of Yecla, and I'm pronouncing this correctly this time. And I've looked at an organic Monastrell from Castano fairly recently, but this is their barrique aged wine. And the point I was making in the last tasting was that actually Castano are well reputed for having introduced the idea of making Monastrell as a quality wine, aging it in oak. So in some ways, this wine should be a better example to illustrate that point. Also, the last wine I looked at was probably one of the best value for money wines I tried in 2025. So I didn't want to let the opportunity pass to try this wine, which equally is not particularly expensive, and see if it also measured up to that same value for money standard. The other thing I should also do is correct myself from my previous video where I pronounced the region as Yecla. I've managed to transpose two letters there, and I should know better because the region concerned is Yecla. So my apologies to any producers from Yecla, particularly the Castanos, and to any of the rest of you who are Spanish speakers that I managed to offend by doing that. I hope you can forgive me. So just to reprise, the Castano family are often given credit for reviving both the fortunes of the Yecla region and also of Monastrell, the principal grape variety that grows there. It's a region that sits in between Humila and Alicante. Now, Ramon Castano established his bodega here in the 1950s. This was a region where the vines had more or less been laid to waste by the spread of the phylloxera aphid, and the remaining Monastrell planted here was simply being used to produce uninspiring bulk wines. During the 1980s particularly, Ramon Castano focused on producing high quality wines from Monastrell that he bottled on the estate rather than sold in bulk. And Ramon's approach opened the door for other producers in the region to start doing the same and to produce a noticeable improvement in the quality of those wines being produced here. Today, Ramon's three sons, Ramon Jr., Juan, Pedro and Daniel, have joined him in the business and contribute to running the company. Now, since his original purchases, Ramon has purchased further land and extended his bodegas. Today, they own more than 400 hectares of land in Yecla, and this is split between 4 estates with 2 modern winemaking cellars equipped with stainless steel tanks to enable them to control temperature and therefore to control the maceration, quite an important aspect of working with the very tannic Monastrell variety. And one of the estates has a dedicated barrel aging cellar that's temperature and humidity controlled, just to give the best possible conditions for the maturation of their premium wines. Now, the Yecla region is about 50 miles inland, and the climate here marks the transition between the coastal Mediterranean climate and the more hot, arid continental climate of central Spain. Rainfall here is low, with an average of just 300 millimeters a year, and that is quite important to the approach to viticulture. Thankfully, there are limestone soils here that efficiently absorb and store the region's winter rainfall. The altitude here also serves to moderate the temperature, and the production zone sits on the eastern edge of the Cordillera Sabetica mountain range. And most of Yecla's vineyards sit in these hills at between 400 and 800 metres above sea level. And the poor quality limestone soils here are quite important for just giving the vines enough stress to ensure they produce concentrated sugars and ripe tannins. The grape variety Monastrell, or Mourvedre as it's known to the French and the Australians, comprises roughly 80% of Yecla's vineyards. This is a variety with thick-skinned berries, intense colour and high levels of potentially mouth-drying tannins. And Yecla's hot, dry summers are absolutely ideal for this late ripening variety. As well as Monastrell, Bodegas Castano does actually produce quite a wide variety of predominantly varietal wines, encompassing a range of styles and also at different quality levels. And these include, but aren't limited to, Grenache, Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon. They have Merlot, Chardonnay, Macabeo. Castano seem to be an approachable, affordable brand suiting a wide range of customers. So the information I have for the vineyard that this wine comes off is that it's within the Yecla region. It's at a high altitude, it's around 750 meters above sea level, and it has a north-south exposure. The soils are sandy soils over limestone, and average vine age is a little over 20 years. Planting density is very sparse. They say there are 1,600 vines to the hectare. If you compare that to, say, Saint-Emilion, where you might get 5,000 or 6,000 vines to the hectare, or the Medoc in Bordeaux, where you might have up to 10,000 in a densely planted vineyard, this shows that this is an area with low rainfall, where the grapes are widely spaced to try and encourage their roots to fill as large an area as possible without competition, so they can find all the water they need to flourish throughout the year. The vines are trained as low bush vines, and viticulture here is entirely organic, with certification for the whole estate having been gained here in 2021. This is a wine from the 2019 vintage. I think at that stage certain individual vineyards were certified as organic, so this must come from one of those. Certainly the back label displays certification as being organic. The certification comes from an organisation that has the acronym CAREM, and that's a regional organisation. That's the Comité de Agricultura Ecológica de la Región de Murcia. And the last information I have here about the viticulture is that average yields are about 3,500 kilograms of fruit per hectare. So as far as the winemaking is concerned, the organic Monastrell is hand-picked. Fermentation, as I say, goes on in stainless steel tanks with temperature control. Temperatures are kept to between 26 and 28 degrees Celsius, so they're not allowed to get up too high, which would increase the extraction of harsher tannins. There's only a short maceration. The skins stay in the fermenting must for just 10 days. The malolactic conversion goes on in the stainless steel tanks, and then the wine is aged just for 4 months in barrel. There's no information on the details I have that tell me what sort of oak is being used, what the size of the barrels are, or how many times they've been used previously. There's no stabilisation goes on, but the wine is lightly filtered into bottle. So let's have a look at it, shall we? The wine has a relatively dark colour, but it's not particularly deep. I can see through it very easily. It's a relatively developed colour as well, so it's sort of ruby to garnet. It's not particularly losing a lot of colour at the rim. Swirling it here, the wine has 14% alcohol, and it's very readily forming tears on the side of the glass. It comes across as a wine that's going to be very concentrated. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? Gosh, my first impressions are that's very definitely Mourvedre or Monastrell. There's a really sort of tight, licoricey nature to the wine. But actually then developing from that, there's a really fresh, perfumed red fruit, quite a pronounced raspberry note that then perhaps becomes a little more jammy and developed. The aromas seem at first to be predominantly quite a straightforward fruit, but the more I nose the wine, the more I notice sort of a chocolatey note, some spicy hints, some cinnamon, some nutmeg, maybe a touch of ginger even. And I think those are perhaps the elements that this sort of short period of oak aging has added to the wine. So let's have a taste, shall we? Yes, it's fairly natural, but it's my instinct to compare this back to the unoaked version of the Monastrell that I've tried. It had quite a lovely, rich, juicy, bursting fruit on the front palate. This, on the other hand, is a little bit more structured. There's a more savoury, more cedary, more spicy, almost through to sort of leathery, developed note on the front palate. It seems as if it's drying out my mouth, but actually it manages to stop before there's a really harsh, drying grip. And it leaves me with a mid-palate, relatively powerful, quite rounded, red fruit, which is framed by developed notes such as forest floor, perhaps leather, and some notes of sweet spice. There's a reasonable length to the wine. The alcohol at 14% isn't overpowering the fruit by any means. The finish remains quite clean, so that leaves me realising that actually the acidity, although it doesn't stand out, is actually sufficient to keep the wine fresh and to give a little life to the red fruit notes that I'm tasting. The wine isn't quite as powerful as I expected. The oak influence actually seems to be restraining the fruit just a little, but at the same time what actually quite impresses me is the way that the tannins have been managed. Given the fact that this is Monastrell, these aren't tooth-suckingly dry tannins. They're giving a touch of grip, but actually they're staying in balance with the fruit and allowing the fruit on the finish to have some quite reasonable length. And during that finish we're getting to see both developed notes and some hints of spice. Now this is a vintage of this wine that doesn't have an individual score on the Wine Searcher website. However, overall all the vintages have an aggregated score of 89 out of 100, and I do think that's a pretty reasonable score for this wine. But in saying that, I'd point out it's not a very expensive wine at all. I will of course leave a link in the notes to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine so that you can see if it's available in your market, and if so, at what price. And if you do look at the prices there, I think you will be quite impressed. This is a wine that has surprised me in a number of ways, but I'm left with an impression of a wine that's been made by somebody who really understands this grape variety. They know these tannins can be harsh and drying, and they've managed to give enough restraint that although I can see all this Monastrell varietal character, it's a wine that manages to maintain really quite an impressive balance right to its finish. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. That would be fantastic. If you are watching these videos and you enjoy them, do please consider subscribing to the channel. That would really help me to develop it further, and also that way you can set yourself an alert and you can be sure to be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your help in that way. And if you have any comments, do please pop them in the comments box below. It would be great to hear what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, my pronunciations, and anything else that relates to that. So thank you once again for watching, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.